I'm from Jersey, all alone. Yes? Okay, look, there's one.
Born in Morristown.
Okay, Morristown too. Not alone. So I'm from Jersey, and I've taught elementary, middle, and high school age students, both in Philadelphia and in East Palo Alto, California. So I kind of have a range of teaching experiences, and I'm looking forward to actually being here at UCLA starting in the fall.
Yeah.
I'm excited about it. I started my career here years ago, and then moved over up to Stanford, and now coming back. So this is a homecoming. It's really great to be here for multiple reasons. For that reason too, and I hope that we can build relationships and have an opportunity to have more long-term connectedness, which is what I really like and enjoy. So hopefully we can do that. So I'm going to introduce myself a little bit, and some of this is going to be, so this is really the first time I'm talking about this to a group on this level after the book has been released. So this just came out in May. We're now barely in June. So I'm crazy excited about it. I almost couldn't stop smiling for a few weeks, right? And so what I want to do is do this as a presentation, but I'll be reading short snippets, so a presentation, book reading, conversation, all in one. Can we do that? Can we explode genres and boundaries? Right? So hopefully we can do that, but I want to also read something I got left out of the book because of space constraints about my own experience. First part, especially, we're going heavy on theory, and we never leave theory behind, right? Because theory, practice go together, praxis. There's no other way to do it. So I do want people to know that these are not theoretical or just theoretical questions for me. My experiences as a teacher of color and a teacher of students of color deeply inform my work on CSP, Culturally Sustaining Pedagogy. Both Django and I have been confronted with the racially discriminatory context of US education our entire lives, first as students and then as teachers. So 20 years ago, that really is a thing. That's 2 decades. I walked into a classroom in Southwest Philly to teach at Turner Middle School. Anybody from Philly?
Yep.
Of course. Way down there on the Green Line near 59th and Baltimore. And upon eagerly presenting my new curricular pedagogical ideas to my new colleagues, was told flatly and assuredly, oh, you're not going to get these kids to write. And some of these kids can hardly spell their own names. Turner's student body at the time was 99.9% black. Don't ask me what the other 0.1% was. With a majority black teaching force. This was back in 1997 in the immediate aftermath of one of the most heated educational debates in, I guess it's still recent history, the Oakland Ebonics controversy, which many of you, of course, know all about. In my senior thesis that same year, 20 years ago, I asked with all earnestness, is it not time to begin developing pedagogies that provide new and innovative approaches to stimulate and motivate our students to mobilize towards educational excellence? How can we begin using pedagogical approaches that value and preserve the many languages and cultures Americans bring to school? As a hip-hop head, deep into the Wu-Tang Clan's 36 chambers,
Checking the audience.
I advocated passionately for the use of hip-hop culture in the classroom. That was my thing. Having become acquainted with the paradigm-shifting ideas of Carol Lee's signifying as a scaffold, right? Gloria Ladson-Billings' culturally relevant pedagogy, and of course, Geneva Smitherman's revolutionary conceptualization of black language in America from the 70s. I joined the call for educators to build upon the cultural linguistic practices of African American students for academic success in the language arts classroom and beyond. In using hip-hop pedagogies to teach and learn from 5th and 6th graders at Turner, I came to view hip-hop culture, i.e. the latest manifestation of African American expressive cultures, not just as a, quote, bridge for academic success, but as a complex and creative culture that had the potential to transform the schooling and life experiences of many of our students. As it turned out, these kids could not only write, but they could write their asses off. And all the while learning new computer skills and graphic design, as well as literacies and research skills, interviewing, transcription, and surveying, and initiating a fundraising campaign to publish several issues of their own magazine. Same kids. With these formative experiences in mind, I would argue a decade later that youth cultural and linguistic practices are of value in their own right and should be creatively foregrounded rather than merely viewed as resources to take students from where they are to some presumably, quote, better place. Back then, for me, it was an important distinction to make that ideological distinction between pedagogies that utilize students' linguistic and cultural resources to help ameliorate the cultural, quote, mismatch between home and school for students of color, and those pedagogies that centered the cultural and linguistic realities of students. Those are two different things. I had a gut feeling from what I had experienced teaching at Turner and my observations of other teachers' evolving practices, including my own, that students often knew when they were being played. You know that, right? No one in this room doesn't know that. They've called you out on it. That is, when their culture was being valued solely to teach them another body of knowledge deemed even more valuable by schools and society. Only much later would I realize that this feeling had been with me ever since my own experience in grammar school. As I reflected on my own experiences and the experiences of my Turner students, it was only then that I was able to articulate this unpleasant gut feeling. In that work, I worried that curriculum would continue to be disconnected from community and culture. That's alliteration. I'm an MC, sort of. That educators might be offering pedagogies that function as a, quote, strawberry-flavored, culturally sensitive pill for our children to swallow, the result of which would ultimately be the same illness, the uncritical devaluation of students' languages, cultures, and experiences. What was needed was a paradigm shift, one that centered our students' abilities and experiences as the sources of knowledge and learning. Django Paris and I have been working on that paradigm shift by proposing a bold terminological and theoretical move from CRPs, culturally relevant pedagogies, to culturally sustaining pedagogies, quote, as an alternative that embodies some of the best research and practice in that resource pedagogy tradition, and as a term that supports the value of our multi-ethnic and multilingual present and future. So we're going to get really deep into the theory this morning, but first, that was just by way of introduction. That's how I came to these ideas. I mean, some of this stuff appears really new, right? 2017. But as you know, these ideas stay with you from the very first moment that you enter the classroom. You begin learning and theorizing instantly, right? Even if you're tired as hell. This is what you're doing. So we're going to talk about this in a lot more depth, but first I want to just give you a quick little, my attempt at a table of contents. I'm going to introduce the CSP crew. I am not your pathology. If you quote anything today, that's it. I am not your pathology. A critical conversation with Toni Morrison about the white gaze. Raising, quote, heavy questions. The kinds of questions we're grappling with and dealing with might not be traditional educational research kinds of questions. Some tenets of culturally sustaining pedagogy. This is not official or final. Okay? You'll encounter some of it in the book, of course, but it's developing and continuing. And an example of what CSPs might look like. I think that's what we'll cover for the entire period. Like, we're not even going to entertain. Okay? So instead, we've developed a pedagogical agenda that does not concern itself with the seemingly panoptic white gaze. Okay? We said from the very beginning that we're going to start not giving a damn about that. Okay? And that's a different starting point. And we can tease the ways that that's a challenge. So I want to make sure that people understand this white gaze because we write about it in the introduction, and we talked about Junot Diaz, but I really want to talk about Toni Morrison because she talks about this beautifully, incredibly well, refusing, returning, and rejecting the white gaze. Before I play it, if we're going to understand the white gaze, I guess the important thing to understand from the very beginning to frame this is that this is not necessarily about any one particular form of marginalization. Instead, it's really about power and relations of power. So you can call that race or racism if you want to, and we call it out when it's necessary. But let's be clear, the central issue, no matter what you're interested in, is power. Because we have race, gender, sexuality, religion, et cetera, class, the body, everything, right, together is about this power play and these relations of power. You don't have to explain that to anybody in 2017 America. You really don't.
There's a partner in front. Okay.
But that's the part you're talking about.
But yes, that was really a telling moment for me. My other question was, I wanted to know what preceded it, because the first words we heard from her, well, I answered the question you didn't pose. So I'm wondering, was there a little tug of war going?
She was talking about Bill, that other dude.
Okay.
Bill Martin?
Okay. All right, I got it.
Because he asked her the question about race. So you see how it starts all stilted and weird and crazy every time folks want to talk about race? It starts crazy, right? So he had to reference another person asking her a question about race in order to ask her a question about race. And that's why it's awkward and weird.
Okay.
But you're pointing out the white-splaining as well, which is critical to this.
Asked at the beginning of her career was kind of reminding me of me as a student of color, as a teacher of color. Like whenever my differences would pop up in the classroom, why is it what's deemed better, right? The white dominant culture. So the fact that she wants to take the white gaze out of her writing, to me it's like, whoa, yeah, that's what I want to be as a teacher too. Right? It's, as a person of color usually with white folks that you don't know that well, that's the expectation because that's our life experience. Right? Of course, once we get to know people as individuals, it's different. But just living in a white dominant society, right, where the foundations are white supremacy, we've learned how to live, or I've learned how to live that way, kind of.
Can I ask you too, and for others as well, did you also recognize some of yourself sometimes when she was almost trying to ameliorate, kind of like, well, maybe I'm reading too much into this, or maybe.
Yeah.
Because there's a way you have
So you knew you were not reading too much into it.
Yeah, but you gotta cajole and you
So it doesn't get
gotta
uncomfortable.
make sure, and this is on TV, and it's a white audience, and you know what I mean? There's, see,
I couldn't be on TV.
yeah, you see. But I think the point is really interesting because these are strategies that are learned that we never think about at all. And you're pointing out that it's daily and it's embedded and it's part of your socialization. As a person of color, as a teacher of color, dealing with colleagues who might not understand what it is that you're saying, stuff that comes second nature as part of your socialization, you have to sort of back off and then press on the pedal and then back off and then press on the pedal, right? Just to be understood and heard. Yeah.
Teacher education point, when I think about white gaze and what we do at the university level, and I think about it as a mom of 2 African-American young girls. And the first thing I think about when I think about my daughters is how they've internalized the white gaze at schools. And how they try to, that they're surely not centered in the curriculum and the instruction when they're in school. The question of what education is for is definitely a dominant norm, and they have started to do exactly what Toni Morrison does and exactly what we do. They have started to explain the reason why certain students in class do not conform to the rest of the class. And that is a white gaze that they look through. Even though they have me as a mom, Black power, right? It doesn't make a difference. They've socialized, they've internalized that. And so they explain away what they consider bad behavior, which happened to be, for them, the African American students that are sitting in the corner, the other, Mexican Americans that sit in the corner. And it's hard to turn off that socialization for them. When they get these images, they get everything every day where they're trying to, if you just do this, You'll be good enough and you can get into UCLA, even though we don't. We got a problem with accepting folks of color here. But, and then I think of it from a teacher ed program and just think about how, you know, consistently we're always talking about how do we not just talk about the rhetoric as Jeannie Oakes say when she started Center X, not the rhetoric, but put the rhetoric into practice, that it is very difficult to, I find myself explaining. That's something I have to work on. I think it's hard for me. It's the piece where I'm trying to make the shift between being culturally responsive to being culturally sustaining, so that I don't have to explain when I work with school districts. It is what it is. It is supposed to be centered there. So it's very interesting. It's a struggle that I'm consistently in teacher ed programs consistently have to think about when they talk about college career going. I mean, all the things that you know.
I mean, this is it's so interesting what you're saying, because this is something that Toni Morrison says on other occasions, and that Junot Diaz himself says as well about white supremacy, is that it's this perpetual lie where you're forced to be on defense the entire time. So people spend years developing research agendas from the defensive position. This is what I meant when I was saying, no, we really are human. And producing bodies of work that have to do that. And so Carol Lee, at that picture where you saw, we were all gathered together, at the end, at one of the lunches, at the very end, I think it was the last breakfast, she was like, no. Stop talking about humanizing. We've been human. The very fact that we're talking about that as a verb suggests that we are somehow complicit in our subhumanization, in our dehumanization. Whoa, right? And the thing about having to explain is that you then somehow become complicit in this weird way. I'm not talking about y'all, I'm talking about all of us, right? In terms of what we choose to do and how we choose to spend our time. We only got so much of it on this earth. How do we choose to spend it? Now, can I just say one more thing about Toni Morrison, and then we'll take right there, is, I didn't know we'd be talking about Toni Morrison today. She says something that I think is profound, and she slows down because she knows it's profound when she says it. And it's this, right? So, when you were talking about that whole idea of internalizing this stuff. So Du Bois talked about this as double consciousness a long time ago, viewing yourself through the lens of the other, that lens of contempt and pity and exoticized kind of perspective, viewing yourself through that sometimes. Measuring yourself by the standards of the other, etc. This is so long ago. Like, we've had over a century and centuries of this kind of thought, critical, liberatory kind of thought. Right? So when she slows down, she talks as someone who has spent her entire life almost as a cautionary tale not to spend for future generations not to have to do that, right? So she's doing that, giving up, and she says, right, so here's, I want to get to the questions we raise. But for Morrison, as soon as she jettisoned, and this is on page 3 if you need the quote, as soon, right in the middle of the second paragraph, as she jettisoned this white gaze, she found herself in a new territory that allowed for boundless creativity, a world of imagination and possibility. Quote, she says, this was brand new space, and once I got there, it was like the whole world opened up, and I was never going to give that up. So what kinds of transformative experiences can we offer our students such that the, quote, whole world of learning opens up for them? One that, like Morrison, they would never want to give up versus one that continually gives up on them. Talking about your children. What can educators of color and other educators in solidarity with us learn from Morrison's courage and conviction to decenter whiteness to envision a world where we owed no explanations to white people about the value of our children's culture, language, and learning potential. No explanations. We don't owe any explanations. Okay? And when I say we want to be in an imaginative kind of space, that's the kind of space that's hard for many of us to even imagine. Because we think, but what about this? But what about that? But what about this? But let's stay in that space of what it would actually mean to owe no explanations to anybody. And when I say white people, be very clear, I mean anyone who reinscribes white supremacist thought. And they don't have to be white to do that, as you all know from our family. Away from that white gaze, or teaching as if it was not that white. You didn't have that white gaze. That's a very difficult thing to do, because that universalizing tendency, right, is the water that we swim in, right? So I think this is very instructive. Two different viewpoints, but if you turn to Morrison, who is perhaps the most instructive on this, and you just read this, you cannot overlook the dimensions of power. Not about translation so that we can all understand each other. This is about being forced to translate. Okay? The force then implies the relations of power. Okay? And so in this case, one of the things that struck me, and these are many things in that interview, was that, right, she turned to African writers. Chinua Achebe, how many of you read Things Fall Apart? How many of you teach Things Fall Apart? Where's that AP lit class? You gonna have Things Fall Apart in that lit class?
Yeah, it's
You know what I'm saying? That book woke me up when I was in college. I didn't get any of the real shit until college.
By the way, I mean, now with Common Core, Things Fall Apart is now being taught in 10th grade.
That's what's up. You know what we have to be so vigilant about? The co-optation of liberatory African literature, right?
It's also on the AP Lit exam.
It's on the AP Lit exam. So now we got to watch it even more closely, right? Because what'll happen is that it'll turn to this celebration of colonialism, which in fact is happening today in South Africa. I just spent 3 months there, just so we know how real this shit is, where one of the leading political officials says colonialism had its benefits. And you go to South Africa, how many of you have been? And you see the situation of everyone who's black and so-called colored living in aluminum squalor, you know what I'm saying, and others in poverty in neighborhoods that look like our quote-unquote ghettos over here, right? And neighborhoods that look like things we can't even imagine. And you got this premier white woman talking about you should be thankful for the roads that we have given you. That's today, 2017. And I don't have to go to South Africa to make that point. And I don't have to have a president named Donald Trump to make that point either. Right? I want to exceptionalize any buffoon, right? Because it's about systems and relations, right, of power and how they're maintained. So for an African American writer to have to look to African literature and be awakened by their use of language and culture and reference that didn't even have a point of explanation. There was no, there's that, remember we talked about that narrator that's speaking over, and they're kind of speaking past the shoulder because they were trying to explain things to white readers, white audiences, and she decided not to do that. That's the motivation where things are already central, where race is already central. Okay? Again, not by accident that sovereignty and authority are chosen. This is in fact colonial, isn't it? These are colonial kinds of questions. We're always the colonial subject, whether you're in the United States, South Africa, Australia, or elsewhere. Find yourself dealing with having to, right, then display what is your sovereignty, both on an individual level and on a national level, on a national scale. As a racialized person having to do that, right? And here's what it's called. Heavy questions. We have a few more minutes before we take our first break or several more minutes. I want to be conscious that we have some time, because now we're going to get into really heavy questions, right, I hope, about this. So as we think about teaching, some of you are already making this connection to your own practice, which is beautiful, and also your own context. As we think about teaching, what would our pedagogies look like if this gaze and, oh now, you think we've been talking about race this whole time? Well, you're right, right? But we're also talking about the kindred patriarchal, cis heteronormative, English monolingual, ableist, classist, xenophobic, Judeo-Christian. I just want to add American in there, because we just go all over the world and be American. Right? Weren't the dominant one. What would that look like, honestly, though? Like, we can't even be in this space ever. Today, we're in this space. Imagine what that would look like. What would liberating ourselves from this gaze and the educational expectations it forwards mean for our abilities to actually envision new and recover and perhaps revitalize community-rooted forms of teaching and learning? Okay? Be very clear, we're not talking about taking where they at, right, and using it to take them somewhere else. We're talking about centering in a whole different kind of framework. It's heavy, that's why I dropped that in the sky. Faye knows I work on this stuff. The transitions are key. So what if the goal of teaching and learning with youth of color was not ultimately to see how closely students could perform white middle class norms, but rather to explore, honor, extend, and at times problematize their practices and investments? These slides, these are heavy questions. I think they are. If you have any questions about them, please hold on to them so that we can have this conversation, because many of us have different answers to these questions, right? So you can see what's embedded in here, right? This question has embedded in it an answer about the purpose of the educational system in the United States. At least one answer, okay? And at times, problematize is something we don't think often enough about. In other words, I'll give you an example from Juno. We were 5 years ago, 2012, I think, 2012, 2013, he was on campus and we were talking, and he gives this whole talk, right? Namely on white supremacy. It's fucking brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. For a whole hour, he broke down white supremacy. For a whole hour. Guess who asked the first question in the room? Okay. Who's going to ask the first question?
White
A white person? A white man? How did y'all know that? Okay. So he asked the question about what can white people do in order to fight what you're talking about, this white supremacy. How can we do this? How can we do that? I marched with, how can we, he Bernie Sanders, I like Bernie Sanders, but he Bernied the whole phenomenon, right? So how can we do this? I've done this, we do this, we practice this, what else can we do? And Juno says, you see, here's the problem. And you see this laser pointer? It was like his eyes were lasered in while he was asking the question. And he was like, the first question has to come from a white man. Second, the person asking the question centers white people in the eradication of white supremacy. Third, we do not need white people to maintain white supremacy. People of color do a good job all by our damn selves. So this is not to say that if we just use our culture and our language that we're going to be free of reproducing cis heteronormativity, racism, colorism, classism, linguistic discrimination, gender discrimination, sexism, ableism. That's what it means, right? So oftentimes when we get to this point, we don't then turn that critical lens inward as a form of loving critique. Okay? We'll talk more about loving critique, but I don't want that phrase to go by unnoticed. because it's really important. Right, and here we've already gone over. What would it mean if we owed no explanation whatsoever to white people about how we talk, think, walk, act, read, eat, sleep? There's a weight being released, right? You can think about this in terms of gender. That often helps, right? Think about this as men and women in a world that's ridiculously sexist, that's run through and shot through with sexism, and the whole system of patriarchy is dominant. What would it look like for women, for example, to not give a damn about the standards that men set for them linguistically in the workplace, in teaching, etc., in terms of how to perform your gender, how you should be a woman, right? So I'm trying to make these links so that we can understand that kind of question, okay, in that. Yes.
What were you getting ready to say? You said connection to Black Lives Matter, what?
So we're connecting this to the Black Lives Matter movement in ways because for both me and Django, this is supposed to be languages, not languages. I just noticed that. But it's supposed to be, so we're linking it to our very lives, and we're asking these kind of profound questions about how do we sustain us, like under these circumstances, right? When we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, it becomes very obvious to anyone the valuation and devaluation of Black lives and Latino lives, et cetera, over others. And so what we're doing is we're not just making this pedagogical argument as if you can do this without a recognition of this context, and specifically dealing with systemic racism as part of how we understand our students' culture, right? So we think of culture in terms of these ethnic terms, right? But in this book, Casey Wong and Courtney Pena, two of my graduate students, have this amazing chapter where culture is also context and environment and practices. So what does it mean when we say our students' culture in the context of police brutality, racial profiling, surveillance, poverty, etc. Right? Not a culture of poverty argument, but how does growing up in that particular condition influence also how we practice culture? That kind of systemic discrimination, right? So that has to be part, it's a difficult part to address, right? But we're not doing this unconscious of that context. So I kind of jumped ahead. We're calling Juno, right, and Black Lives Matter. It's literally, for us, about sustaining our minds and bodies as communities of color. Right? Because it's a schooling system that has often had the exact opposite goals.
I like that when you use the word, how we're using the word bodies, our bodies. Ta-Nehisi Coates uses that in his book, My Body.
Yeah.
I like how we're using that.
It makes it
Very personal.
It brings it home.
And yeah.
It really brings it home. I mean, there's a way to talk about disembodied identities as if it's this weird abstract thing, but no, this is us that we're dealing with. There's so much more to say to figure out what to say and not say. Okay. Juno Diaz, I want to do one last reading on page 13. If you have your book, it's on page 13. By way of sort of summary, made it so concise. We was talking about for an hour, he summed it up in this. Right? And I think for us, we're dealing with this question of survive and thrive. And I think that's the space where your question comes from, right? I think you want us to be past survival, okay? And so do I, right? So when he's saying this, it also made me think about, and by the way, this is riffing on Audre Lorde, for those of you who know her work. So we believe that CSP, like all critical asset-based approaches, is at heart about survival, a survival we want to sustain through education, and about changing the conditions under which we live and work by opening up new and revitalizing community-rooted ways of thinking about education beyond, as Morrison reminded us, the white gaze. We want to create conditions where children of color can both survive and, as I said, thrive. Toward this effort, and this was something that Carol Lee, another one of our huge inspirations, for those of you who know her work, you know why. Few people keep it as really real as Carol Lee does in getting to the heart of the matter. She shares in her chapter in this volume, which is so powerful, if particular cultural practices and belief systems allowed people of African descent in the US and the diaspora to survive and thrive through enslavement and Jim Crow, America's 2 centuries of legal apartheid, then it seems reasonable that sustaining these practices, right, and strategic transformations in response to changing conditions is a worthwhile goal. So for Carol, her starting point is, well, wait a minute. When you ask the question, what are you seeking to sustain? How about all the knowledge that has enabled us to survive up until this point? Through slavery, through genocide, through land theft, right? Through the atrocities that we know historically. But we rarely view through the lens of the knowledge that communities had to have and share in order to survive that brutality. That's what Carol makes starkly clear, is that, wait a minute, there's a reservoir, right? We're not ill-equipped to take on the white gaze or white supremacy or colonialism. But how do we dig back now and reinterpret and understand our history as one of knowledge that needs to be sustained, not just survival? Okay? The gravity of this statement and this work writ large, she lays it to bear, Carol Lee here, and further provokes another set of questions, which are on the top right now of page 14. Under the latest iterations of white supremacist, capitalist, cis-heteropatriarchal ideologies, systems, and practices, what knowledges must we sustain in order to overcome and survive when faced with a power that seeks to sustain itself above and beyond and sometimes shot through our bodies? CSP is indeed about providing our children with the opportunities to survive and thrive, but it's also centrally about love. A love that can help us see our young people as whole versus broken when they enter schools, and a love that can work to keep them whole as they grow and expand who they are and can be through education. For us, even if you turn back to page 1, there's a reason why we begin, right, with this question. You know this. Across the centuries, countless philosophers and teachers and legions of students have asked the age-old question, and we're coming back to the beginning, what is the purpose of schooling? In the context of the United States and other nation states living out the legacies of genocide, land theft, enslavement, and various forms of colonialism, the answer to this question for communities of color has been rather clear. The purpose of state-sanctioned schooling has been to forward the largely assimilationist and often violent white imperial project, with students and families being asked to lose or deny their languages, literacies, cultures, and histories in order to achieve in schools. So in the United States and beyond, the saga of cultural linguistic assault has and continues to have devastating effects on access, achievement, and the well-being of students of color, right, in our schools. From the very first sentence, we are rooting this in processes that are much larger and occur beyond the classroom, right, that influence everything that we see in our classrooms. Okay. Lastly, as we continue to think through the promises and challenges of culturally sustaining pedagogy, this is on page 15, the last paragraph. We are hopeful that our work in this volume can join young people, educators, communities, and scholars in our collective struggle against an educational system that contains us and towards one that sustains us. In other words, for those of you who studied sociology or cultural theory, social theory, and you've learned about the ideological state apparatus, okay, which essentially suggests that the schooling system, right, is an apparatus of the state, and it functions to uphold the state's ideology, right? Not just about teaching you, it's teaching you how to be citizens. What's a citizen in accordance to what's defined by the state as a citizen, okay? So it's very easy to understand why particular activist groups, let's just take Black Lives Matter in the current moment, are described not as citizens but as terrorists, for example, right? So this is part of the larger question that we have to deal with, right? On these terms and on these grounds. I want to, for a second, see if I could. So I work on these issues from a global perspective, the performance of race and ethnicity in speech events, from politics to hip hop to the classroom. Just giving you a quick sense. I already told you that I've worked a lot on hip hop culture in the United States and elsewhere, and now the use of linguistic and anthropological research, importantly for us in this discussion, to develop language pedagogies for racial-linguistically marginalized youth. Right? This is in South Africa, one of the writing ciphers we have with young men there. You know my steez, this work where I think Faye mentioned early on. I'm not going to run this down all for you, but I will just talk to you as I slide through it, because this will really take us into a whole another realm. But I do want you to see how these ideas grow out of research done over the last 2 decades with students in schools. So this is in a community, largely community of color, multilingual, multilectal. It's changed over time. And my essential mission here as a researcher was to understand style. What we saw in the Heat Trippin' video is just part of that, right? But what is linguistic style, speech style, how is it interactive, et cetera? How do people do and create style and co-construct it on multiple occasions? And all these large theoretical questions. I did the sociolinguistic quantitative sort of variation stuff, which some of you are familiar with. If you know Bill Above's work from way back. He was one of my teachers in undergrad. So without going into crazy detail about this, but it's perfect actually linked to heat tripping. Remember we talked about he is tripping, he's tripping, he tripping, all those variations of the copula? This is actually what I've studied here in conversations recorded, etc. And you get to find out, I don't know how obvious this is to people, so I'll go really quickly. If it's not obvious, you could say something. The copula is patterned based on all of these, the following grammatical environment, the subject you use, the person, the preceding and following phonological environment. You get to have this numbering and this patterning where the copula appears or doesn't appear based on all of these different factors, and lo and behold, the race and gender of the person you're talking to, right? Speakers also shift the language they use very specifically, right? And familiarity with hip hop culture is something I also tested for. So you get to see the results where youth in this school use for shorthand more black language features with black speakers, male speakers, and hip hop literate speakers. So that connection, right, between language, gender, and culture and race is made very clear just by an analysis of how students talk. Now, mind you, this is done in a context where I can't tell you how many teachers I've spoken to that repeat the mantra of their students don't know how to code switch. And that they can't change styles and shift out of styles, and they don't know when to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the mantra. The more I talk to teachers both in Philly and California, I realize, man, this shit is an American script. It's not even based on empirical evidence. It's just an American cultural script based on what? Deficiency, right? Racialized minority status, quote unquote, et cetera. It's a cultural script more than anything. You know when Morrison says it's not a literary question but a sociological one? This is what was happening with language. It wasn't even a linguistic one. It was a sociological one. It was a reading and an interpretation of people's language as deficient teachers used language of what their students couldn't do. Students used what we can do. Here's what we do with our language. It was fascinating. There was conflicting ideologies. So what you see here, really quick, without needing to pay attention too much to the details, is one student who represented the overall graph of the data writ large. You have him talking to a white female non-hip hopper here, using this form of black language 0 times, percentage of the time, 0. And the more you changed race and gender and peer group, the same student switches and uses that black language feature almost 100% of the time. So you can do this when you record people speaking over different contexts and situations to see how the most minor linguistic feature changes based on race. And you get some unexpected shit, or perhaps it's expected, where you have a white male speaker where black language is used here, right? But in talking to a white male speaker, more than it's used in talking, right, to a black woman who was not into hip hop culture. So you have people who surpass their racial cell based on their cultural literacy of hip hop, for example. Right? So it's hip hop culture and other factors can be mediating in terms of race and gender. It's not always the sociological constructs that we have in our head, but there are cultural mediators. I think that represents something that is both just interesting and also hopeful in terms of we don't have to be constricted to our racialized gendered cells that researchers put us in. Right? We can actually move beyond that. So teachers had ideologies of lack, and students had ability, ideologies of ability and creativity. So this led to a theory of developing more with other scholars, this theory of black language in white public space. And this you all know, where essentially white mainstream English and white mainstream ways of speaking what become constructed as those, right? Become the invisible, or rather inaudible and unmarked norms of communicating in academic settings. Right? We act as if terms like this are not race and class and gender, but they are. And we have the data to show it. So this holds across all contexts. These are the conflicting language ideologies I was telling you about. One of these conversations that I had with students was most revealing, where I was talking with a student named Latasha about how she shifts her speech styles over different situations. And I had interviews with students describing this, not just the teachers, the students, right, as well. So Latasha says, yeah, like the way I talk to my teacher ain't the same way I talk with the 3L click. I'm just supposed to know who the 3L click is. 3L click, what's that? All of our names begin with L, so we named our clique after that, the 3L click. It's Amelia, Latoya, and Lamar. And how is the way you all talk different from the way you talk to the teacher? Well, it's like, you know that rapper Nelly? Does anybody still know that rapper Nelly? I'm gonna laugh, because I ain't gonna say that about Nelly. Yeah. How you say everything like her, like for here he'll be like her. Yeah, I ain't from around her. That's how we try to talk. Why though? Because we like it. There's an implicit dummy right here. Ever watch Sanford and Son? Ever watch that show? Dummy. There was an implicit dummy right there from 2003. That's how long this goes back. So this, I mean, what was so beautiful about this was at the time, right, the teachers were describing students and what they can't do. But look at all you have to know to flex, right? That distinction, that phonological distinction. You have to know what's standard. You have to know what's quote unquote stigmatized and regional, right? And you have to push it and play with it even though you're not from that region where that's spoken and said, right? So you're inventing all the time and pushing the boundaries of black language, let alone quote unquote standard language, right? So there's a way where we completely overlook what our students are actually doing with language. And this is another situation, I've talked about this a lot, so I don't feel like getting too much into it, but it's not just the linguistic system, but it's the linguistic practice. To make the link explicitly, and I think we're done soon after this, for now, for the break, is CSP rejects the white gaze. So for too long, what we've discovered is even well-intended, even progressive, counter-hegemonic, quote-unquote, critical pedagogies, right? For too long, scholarship on access and equity has centered implicitly, right, or explicitly on the white gaze-centered question. That's a bulky adjective, but centered, right, explicitly or implicitly on the question derived from one who holds the white gaze. Right? How can we get these working class kids of color to speak right, be more like middle class white ones, rather than critiquing the white gaze itself that sees, hears, and frames students of color in every which way as marginal or deficient. So we actually have a choice in something that we are presented as immutable and unchangeable. But there actually is a choice. We don't have to do, right, that white gaze-centered practice of critiquing, right, these kids and getting them to sound like those kids, right, as shorthand for every single way racializing hegemony works in school. Right? We could actually turn our critique on the white gaze itself, right, and ask why does it see, hear, and frame our students every which way as marginal or deficient. Okay? We actually have that choice. One of the things that we always talk about, Faye, is when we start to think about what can I do in my classroom, but it's so difficult, but I only have this amount of time, etc. The question and the choice you're actually posed with is, do I want to uphold hegemony, or do I want to disrupt it? That's the question you always have with you. It's never not a choice. Okay? I think, oh man, can I play this and then we take a break? Do y'all know this? Okay.
Oh.
These questions come from a position, right, where, like I said, in every which way. I talk about language a lot. I'm a linguist. Language is what I think about. But in every which way, you're framed as deficient or marginal. You have to move from point A to point B if you want to be successful, right? Upward mobility depends on you acquiring our norms for success, and we actually define what that success is for you, right? That's a problem. So now, if anybody's paying attention to the psycholinguistic research, which I hope you are not, you've heard this term language gap. Right? Has anyone heard it? It's like on NPR and shit now. Like, anytime they can talk about our deficiencies in neutral, non-racialized language, it somehow makes it onto things like NPR, things progressive. This is what I'm talking about, all these venues, liberal venues. You still get this discussion. So whose language gap? The research frames people of color, Blacks, Latinos in particular, having a language gap when it comes to white children. I don't have to tell you how that language gap is explained, like cultural deficiency, pathology, raising children in a particular way. I also don't have to tell you what language they're looking for when they're measuring the gap between, right? There's things that I don't have to tell you, right? So this racializing hegemony obviously enters our research as well, right? And it enters the kinds of things that are deemed official and acceptable. Right? And so Django and I wrote this piece in the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology, okay? It was an entire special issue critiquing the language gap research for its methodology, for its false theoretical premises. I mean, you're gonna go into somebody's home. You don't go to a black family's home, Latino's family home, pop on your tape recorder and count the words that you recognize? What? How does that work in a multilingual home? How does that work when you have discussions like the one you're about to hear And this is why we frame whose language gap, right? Rejecting, returning the white gaze. So whose language gap? So I gotta play this because I think it's an excellent demonstration. This baby's 1 year old. Right? 1 year old, a representative of a community who will be labeled by that research as having a language gap or deficiency. This mother will be labeled by that research as not talking to her children, as not knowing how to socialize her children in terms of language. Okay? Oh my God, that don't make you mad. So, also cute as hell.
Hey girl, and then I told him, is you crazy? Girl. Crazy. And can you believe he tried to ask me to get up first to get your breakfast? Girl, you crazy. Guess what? I found some SeaWorld tickets for free from military girl. We're gonna have to go. They got water, they got animals. Girl, yes. I'm excited, girl. Yes, girl. I fell out. Couldn't believe it.
I'm trying to tell you, she said.
Girl. Huh? Girl, can you believe it? Yeah. You tripping, girl.
Oh my God. Okay. Comments? What do you notice in terms of our discussion of pathologizing and language gaps, etc.? What do we see? It's just anyone, shout it out. Yeah.
Oh, I just, first of all, she just reminds me of my granddaughter. This whole thing where you, first of all, your mommy is modeling. This is how we talk, and baby girl's picking up on that very well. But also able to add her own things into the conversation. It's not just repeating mommy. She's not parroting.
Yes.
Wow.
Can I tell you that there's I don't want to say a cultural difference in a cultural competence or incompetence in interpreting what you just stated so clearly, that some may view this as parroting, right? But according to this kind of pathologizing research, right? Black parents don't do this with their children, number one, and that children are not verbally responsive, number two. So there's a language gap, right? So in one comment, you've exploded both of those things instantly, right? What else?
Well, this is a language. This is their language. It is a legitimized language. Then I view this as that this is part of her identity, and then as soon as she goes into a school, she will lose that. She will either lose it or be ashamed of it, depending on the teacher, depending on the system that she goes through.
So that's beautiful because it makes a really explicit point, which I haven't made, but I talk about a lot as African American language as a linguistic system, right? And not just as a linguistic system, but the most complex variety of quote unquote English, if you want to call it that, right? In the United States. So the tense system, the verbal aspect system, everything is in fact more complex. Why is it more complex, right? Why, right? Because African languages, European languages, creolization, boom, you got two grammars. Boom, you got two phonological systems coming together to produce something that Toni Morrison says is the cruel fallout of racism. Not just because of slavery and the socio-political context in which it developed, right? But also because this child will come to school with more present tenses than her textbooks and will be told that her language is less than the language she's being told is superior.
She's doing what Geneva Suleiman says, talking and testifying.
What? Talking and testifying. Write that down.
She's talking and testifying because her mother's saying things about her father and she's testifying to it. And the other thing is the verbal fluency of that child. If a white person were listening to that, would not recognize the intelligence, the insight of that child.
Yes.
Can I don't know if you noticed this. Did you see that part in the middle when she's talking and the mother goes, "Can you believe that girl?" And she goes, "No." The part where she goes, "No." Like, I've thought about that a lot, and it seems it's almost as if she disrupted the routine there. And kids will do this, right? They'll do it intentionally at times. Sometimes they make socialization errors, right? That they're not really sure how the routine works, or they maybe have fallen out of it when they should be in it. But in this case, her face, she looks at her mom and goes, "No." She looked right at her and said no, and her mom's response was returned with a smile. So it was like there was this disruption. I mentioned that because you mentioned the intelligence. Okay, so what often gets mentioned is the reverse. And I don't have to tell anyone who studied African American language, when you see, oh, it's right on it, he tripping, right? One, what's the school gonna do? We're gonna go crazy because it's not he is tripping. It's not even he's tripping, it's he tripping. That's a transcription. That like talking and testifying on Geneva Smitherman's book title. Please write that down. That was a classic book. You want to understand black language and its racialized discussion and controversy. It's talking and testifying in the language of black America. Okay. 1977, the year I was born. Which I tell Geneva all the time. You tripping, right? That's the copula. Is completely and wholly unnecessary, okay? In this linguistic system, wholly unnecessary. Like, he tripping, he's tripping, he is tripping. No one would ever really say he is tripping, but the option to say it is there, right? That variation is intrinsic, also within G. Autocorrect be putting G's on everything I write. What's up with that? It be putting it on there. That's like it's like a form of linguistic imperialism. We joked about this online. There's a couple of linguists. It's like linguistic imperialism all up in the Mac. Like, you managed to work it into Siri, like, or to my text dictation, and put a G on that. Okay, but this is how, like, you know, one letter or one sound could actually be political in funny and not so humorous ways, because this would be deemed an error. This would be deemed a mistake that needs to be fixed and corrected. So what does that say to that child about her mother?
Or her family.
Or her family, or her community, or her history, or her people. What does that say when researchers walk into a classroom, right, or to a home and start recording, right, and the child switches into Spanish and between Spanish and English, for example, right? I have the opportunity to visit right now a 2-year-old girl whose name is Serat. She is a child of Tunisian Parisian mother and a Mexican American father. And she switches at 2 years old between English, French, and Arabic, and Spanish. Wow. Like it's nothing. How many of her words will be counted by monolingual, monocultural researchers right, in this kind of experience. And I don't have to point to the exception. This just happened to be captured on YouTube. Okay? This just happened to be captured on YouTube. This is not exceptional. Okay? This goes on in homes, the very homes that you claim were deficient and pathological. This goes on. Babies being able to switch between 3 or 4 languages goes on almost every corner of the globe, except the United States and other sort of monolingual